everyone. Welcome to the next part of our post-debate analysis series for Debatable Open 2024. With me today is Gab Pacaño from the UP Debate Society. Hello. We're so
Hello,
happy
Kyle.
to have you.
I'm happy to be here as well.
So, Gab, you're a motion contributor for the Philippines motion set for Debatable Open 2024. Let's have a brief rundown of each one of these motions. So, the first motion that I wanted to talk about is this House regrets the designation of the CPP-NPA as a terrorist organization. The info slide reads that in 2017, the former President Rodrigo Duterte signed a proclamation formally designating CPP-NPA as a terrorist organization. So, Gab, how would you frame this on side government? Like, who is the House? Who is the one who will be doing the regretting of the designation here?
I think it's mostly in a stance of a neutral observer and how they feel like and how they see CPP-NPA as an organization. I think for government, it's really, really important to assess the ways by which the designation has affected other organizations or other progressive organizations, considering how terrible terror tagging is in general, especially in the Philippines. So if you look at it, the level of distinction of the government towards the CPP-NPA and the other progressive groups, especially the youth organizations in the Philippines, like for example, Anak Bayan, League of Filipino Students, or even progressive party lists like Bayan Muna or Gabriela party lists, is a bit weak. So the way they see CPP-NPA and the way they equate these organizations can be a bit similar. So terror tagging, if I may add, bleeds into the ways by which the government also red tags these progressive groups. So I think, number one, the impact of terror tagging is worsened primarily because of the designation of CPP-NPA as a terrorist organization. So I think it's really important for government to not only assess CPP-NPA in a vacuum, but also include other organizations that are being included in the conversation whenever the government or the state talks about CPP-NPA.
So this is basically like this sets a precedent, right? Like that's the framing that you want to bring up on government side, where because you have this designation of the CPP-NPA, who's next? And so you see a lot of actors like Lorraine Badoy just like red tagging left and right, saying, for example, the Gabriela party list is a front for the CPP-NPA and stuff like that. But
Yep.
what I want to ask is, how would Gov go about mechanizing that? Because it's very intuitive to say, oh yeah, this is the first step and it snowballs into everyone who I disagree with is a terrorist. But how does that actually work in the real world, like step by step?
All right. So in terms of mechanizing this, the first is creating a distinction between what a terrorist organization is and how different CPP-NPA is and why in various interpretations it could be different, particularly because in government they could argue or even define the difference of CPP-NPA and why it could be or why it could not be a terrorist organization in particular. The second is in terms of the definition, there's a validity towards the political ideology of CPP-NPA in particular. So it's really, really important for government to define what a terrorist organization is in definition and why in some various interpretations, CPP-NPA could not be a part of that.
So what would be a strategic way to define terrorist for Gov here?
I think number one, the way that government can go about it is to just say that terrorist organizations incite fear without a particular avenue or without particular advocacy or without a particular cost to it. So it's pursuance of violence without any good outcome that can come out of it. But of course, this can be twisted by definition. So opposition can also respond to this by saying that the process by which these groups operate can cause casualties or can cause particular damages to infrastructure and can cause particular damages to private property. So these particular discussions operate on the gray area of whether or not the violence that is caused by insurgency is valid or not. So I think these are particular things that can be discussed and can be further explored by government when defining what the terrorist organizations look like and why the designation of CPP-NPA is truly regrettable.
So what I would say here is on Gov, the way that you would like to define terrorism, like true terrorism, is just the use of violence against civilian targets for no reason at all.
Yes.
Whereas on the other hand, opposition's version or ideal version of what terrorism is basically it doesn't matter if it's for a greater purpose or to serve particular ends, as long as you're attacking civilians, you're automatically a terrorist.
That's a good way to put it.
Now, for opposition, I was really wondering about this because I am I'm pretty sure that many debaters, if not all of them, kind of agree that red tagging and terror tagging is bad. So
Mhm.
this is very challenging for debaters because they have to I imagine it might be very challenging for debaters because they have to let go of some of these biases, especially if they're on opposition. So what would you say would be a very strong, intuitive case for opposition here?
All right. So since I told you earlier that this debate can be framed in a neutral observer stance, I think one of the key things that can be explored here is the general fear incited by insurgency in general. So there are reported cases of casualties caused by the group or in particular or caused by the organization. So even if this report is valid or not, or the fact that the numbers can be twisted by, I don't know, misinformation or the government inciting misinformation, there's a particular validity to it, given that insurgency in general is scary, especially for people. So to put it simply, I think the fact that other people are going to be affected by the military encounters or are going to be or can be affected or can be harmed by the process of violence incited by these organizations can be a valid way to say that these are terrorist groups or organizations and the government has to do something about it. So I think that's one way to put it. I think that secondly, in general, a lot of countries have already designated the new People's Army as terrorists, including the United States. So to some extent, there's already a sense of validity to the label that is placed upon the New People's Army. So I think those are ways by which opposition can explore the labeling of it being a terrorist group or organization. I think the third thing is about the general obligation of the state to simply protect itself from insurgency. So opposition can explain why if we don't label them as terrorist organizations, the government is going to be too weak whenever we engage with them, or it's going to be a lot harder for the government to keep stability. So I think opposition can take a more controversial route of saying that stability is important and upending the government as a whole as one of the processes of or what is one of the process of insurgency or insurgent groups is invalid for the same reasons that there are many ways to change the current system through reforms or more peaceful means. So I think those are the ways that opposition can explore whenever they talk about labeling the NPA as a terrorist organization. But then again, they have to contend with the precedents that this will set or the implications that this will put other organizations in.
One of the things I was thinking about here was a book that I read quite a while ago entitled What Terrorists Want by Louise Richardson. And
Mhm.
she said that they might have legitimate grievances, but they are not okay with getting those changes in the regular democratic processes.
Mhm.
So I think one of the things that you can argue here on opposition is you have to accept that there are civilian casualties, otherwise there is no debate at all, right? So
Mhm.
what you can say now on opposition is the best way to have them get those changes and at the same time protect the civilian population is to designate them as a terrorist organization, because now you have a bargaining chip where actually it works for the CPP-NPA as well, where they can say, okay, we are going to stop hurting civilians, we're going to stop our military efforts, but only if you negotiate with us, right? Like they
Mhm.
have this bargaining chip where we're gonna lay down our arms if and only if you start negotiating with us, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense, and I do think it's a very good angle to explain why the labeling can be somehow justified, and it could be a bargaining chip for the group. And I do agree, like huge percentage of the reasons for why a lot of people go into the countryside and take up arms is because they do think that the system has already failed them, and any forms of reform is not going to be effective, especially if it's placed under capitalism or it's placed under the hands of the bourgeoisie. So I do think that these are the reasons for why people opted to be insurgents in general. So I do think that's a good context to have the debate operate in. And this is for Gov actually.
Yeah, but another thing that I was thinking of for Gov, because I took up a class on terrorism in law school, and one of the very interesting things that I learned there is the methods by which they recruit members. The reason why a lot of people go to these terrorist organizations is when they're convicts, when they're prisoners or something, they feel like they're isolated from a community. So because they feel isolated from the greater society, they're more vulnerable to terror groups going like, hey, join us because we're going to provide you that support system. We're going to provide you with that community. And this is an actual study from the BJMP, the Bureau of Jail Management and Penology, I think, where they said this is the modus for a lot of these terror organizations. And so by designating them and red tagging them, you're pushing them further in isolation, especially if, since we're talking about precedent earlier, right? If
Mhm.
you're going to red tag, terror tag everyone who disagrees with you, and that started from the designation of the CPP-NPA as a terrorist organization, that just strengthens the CPP-NPA more because now they get to say, oh, we're being oppressed, right? And we can provide you with that support system. Like if you disagree even slightly with the government, they're going to shun you and you can come to us for support.
I think it's also really important for government to explain the ways by which this has resulted. So number one, for example, it resulted to the creation of NTF-LCAC, or the government organization formed through the government organization designated to end countryside insurgency. So I do think that this is a bit controversial to the extent that we are putting a lot of funds to have it operate within multiple levels. So just last year in 2023, if I may recall correctly, they poured in 6.3 billion into the operation for operations of NTF Alca. So I do think that the labeling, or in retrospect, the designation of CPP-NPA has given the government more ammunition to pour in more funding towards pulling people away or pushing people away more from, I don't know, from the ideology itself, or being more punitive, especially when they engage with CPP-NPA, which I do think that could lead to further hostility from the group itself. So I do think that this could be one of the consequences of branding them as terrorists, like what you said. So they're more likely to be hostile. They're more likely to feel isolated. They're less likely to participate in peace talks or negotiations.
I feel like it should be uncontroversial to say that, killing civilians is wrong,
Mhm.
right? That being said, the purpose of this debate is more of like a policy thing, right? Like, of course it's bad, but what should we do about it as the government, right? Will we just end up making bad actors or like these groups stronger and more likely to commit acts of violence with this policy than without? So I think now we can move on to the next motion, which is this House believes that the characterization of the EDSA Revolution as peaceful does more harm than good. So what I want to ask you first here is, why did you decide to put this in this set?
All right. So, as someone from UP, I think one of the things that I often hear is people can always mobilize and people can always protest peacefully. And while I do think that's valid, I think it thoroughly discounts the other ways by which people can also pursue violence as a means. Although I'm not saying that this is correct, but I'm saying that in other circumstances, this can be the only last resort for marginalized groups to forward their agenda. So as someone who is deeply passionate about indigenous people's rights, I do agree that violence can be unjustified in some contexts, but in their circumstances, given that they're ridden with hopelessness or the fact that the entire society has often shunned them, or even their own government representation from NCIP is one of the perpetrators of systemic violence and oppression. There are reasons for why a lot of them take up arms or even pursue violent means of forwarding their advocacies. And I do think that the characterization of massive or major revolutions in the Philippines as peaceful often harms the optics of how other people or other groups can pursue their own advocacies or pursue their own mobilizations in particular. So I think that number one, while EDSA Revolution or characterizing EDSA Revolution as peaceful can be technically correct, the process by which the process that led to the EDSA Revolution is not as peaceful as it seems. So I do think that it's very ahistoric to say that EDSA Revolution is peaceful because the events that led to it is bloodshed or is characterized by casualties or people going missing or getting killed by the Marcos Senior administration.
I feel like it speaks to a broader problem that we're experiencing with the way that we treat history, in that when we think of history, we think of events. Like something happens and then after that event, it's done. Whereas it would be more productive to think of it as a timeline, as something that's
Yeah.
constantly happening, right? So the idea that the EDSA revolution was bloodless does more harm than good, because we forget about everything that led up to it, because we
Yeah.
treat it as like a particular and discrete and distinct event, rather than, something that was a culmination of something else. But more than that, aside from the philosophy of history, what impacts can you imagine being argued here on SideGov? How does it affect the real world, this ahistoric view of EDSA revolution?
All right. I think one of the things that I've read in one of the comment sections in Facebook, as argued by a loyal fan of Marcos, was the reason for why EDSA revolution is peaceful is because Marcos administration is peaceful. Like the police force is not as violent, which led to individuals being able to portray or express themselves politically. And while that is not true in all sense, I do think that this can be intuitive to the extent for an average person to think that, well, maybe the reason for why EDSA revolution is peaceful is because Marcos Sr. is benevolent to the degree that he's not willing to harm protesters that are willing to overthrow him as a leader. So it extends to the ahistoric nature of the event or ahistoric nature of how people can characterize the event. The second impact can be more about the ways by which this could affect other means of protests that people can take. So it could lead to the sanitization of protests or rallies. So they can go against the burning of effigies or even other forms of protests that are not as quote unquote peaceful or not as not as acceptable to or palatable to people. So this can affect the ways by which other people can pursue their mobilizations in general.
Yeah, so I was thinking here, like, it's kind of weird that if you do something slightly wrong as a protester, it's automatically something that invalidates the entire movement in the eyes of some people, just going like, because you vandalized some pieces of property, we shouldn't listen to you anymore. Why can't you be
Yes.
more like the EDSA revolution people who didn't do anything bad? So
Yeah.
I totally get where you're coming from, but on op, how can you imagine opposition rebutting these things and like making their own case here?
All right. So in terms of palatability, it can be an argument in favor of opposition, given that the threshold of acceptance for protests in general is very low, especially in the Philippines. So a lot of people would not accept your means of protest if it doesn't fit their interests, or not their interests, but their level of acceptance. So it's really, really important for you as a movement to also strategize the by to strategize the ways by which people can accept you, or can accept the ways by which you mobilize your group. So if your movement is strategic enough to frame yourselves as peaceful or non-violent or acceptable or palatable to the general public, then I think that this can be a good way to send or forward your message. So if the characterization is effective, then other movements can also cling to that strategy to maintain their palatability, or to maintain the level of acceptance that individuals have to the movement, or to the protest, or the mobilization, or actions, or course of actions that these groups commit.
So how would they mechanize it? Because off the top of my head, the only thing I can think of right now is if you are super peaceful, people will feel bad for you. Like if the police keep silencing you or suppressing you, and all you're doing is you're being peaceful, then many people, like observers, will say, "Oh, that's too bad. They weren't even doing anything bad or violent. Why are you suppressing them? Why are you silencing them? I'll join their cause." But I feel like it's very up in the air,
Mhm.
or kind of vague for me, because I'm not really sure whether that still works, right? Like, because I imagine, okay, let's have a protest. Let's go occupy a particular street. I imagine a lot of people will be like, they're not doing anything violent, but I am very inconvenienced because this is causing traffic. So in today's society, how do you imagine opposition arguing this particular point?
I think opposition can also say that in relation to the first motion, that not all activists or not all advocacy groups are going to pursue violence, given that the level of acceptance of people towards violence is very, very low, especially because it's really bad. So if that is the case, movements can use this as a reference point to latch on to the success of the EDSA revolution, to forward or to even pursue their advocacies. But to answer your question, I do think that if people are inconvenienced in both sides, then it's going to be the case in both sides. So I don't think it's part of the debate of whether or not people are going to accept, but this exists in the spectrum of where people are more likely to accept. And I think that's one of the strategies that these movements can particularly take. So the non-characterization of EDSA revolution as peaceful can further affect the optics of how progressive groups operate or forward it, which could also mean that it's more likely for them to be attached to insurgent groups, or the groups that the government deems as terrorists.
One of the things I was thinking of as you were talking about that is when you said it's an example that you can latch onto, I'm wondering if now you give a lot of more modern progressive groups the opportunity to say we are the inheritors of the EDSA revolution because we're also nonviolent. And I am not sure if there's a way to argue this on opposition. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, but one of the things that I thought of just now was Filipinos really love this thing of, continuing a legacy. And to some extent, you can see this is why our current president is Marcos, right? Because he's continuing the legacy of his father, which was cut, unfortunately, short, right? That's the narrative that they're saying. So I'm wondering if there's a possible strong case here for opposition to say that we are the inheritors of like this unambiguously good movement that the entire world was enamored by us for. Like we were invited to the UN, we had like the longest standing ovation in the UN's history at the time and stuff like that. So if you're the inheritors of this very peaceful revolution, you could be a hero, like, and stuff like that. Is there a way for opposition to argue this point?
Well, I think given the support, given that this is characterized as peaceful, you're more likely to get the support of liberal organizations like the UN or other Western liberal, you're more likely to get coverage of other Western liberal media organizations. And I do think that can be a potential angle in terms of exploring the liberal bias that people have over peace in general, and why a lot of people value peace over other forms of or other means that could potentially enact change.
So aside from all these things, do you have anything else to add for the second motion?
For the second motion, I think for government, they can present an alternative and say that it's better if we characterize EDSA revolution in many other ways, not just peaceful. Because whenever we hear about EDSA revolution, we often hear about it being nonviolent or it being peaceful. And often this is the central theme of the revolution in and of itself. And I do think it's good for government to think of other ways to characterize the EDSA revolution, to particularly show the context by which certain events that led to the EDSA revolution as an event that particularly shows the event in general and why it happened in the first place. So there are many other ways up to government to define or characterize the EDSA revolution aside from it being peaceful. And I do think that's also valid.
All right, so I think we can move on to the last motion in the set, which is, I feel like, is really, really complicated, but only in the sense that this is not my forte because Nina is the one who is really into international relations and that kind of diplomatic strategy. The third motion reads, this House believes that the Philippines should abandon friend to all, enemy to none. And this is a doctrine that, according to the info slide, it is the current independent foreign policy of the Philippines, which aims to forge alliances with other nation states by remaining neutral in times of global conflict. So I think the first question I'd like to ask you here is there a difference between friend to all, enemy to none, and something like Switzerland, which is just neutral all the time? Like, is there a time where the Philippines, even under friend to all, enemy to none, under this doctrine, they will have to, take a stance in a particular conflict?
All right. I think the reason for why Switzerland, correct me if I'm wrong, is neutral is because there are reasons or economic opportunities that these countries wanted to acquire. So the reason for why Switzerland wanted to remain neutral is because they wanted to be the banking capital of the world. For the Philippines, we're developing, so we wanted to get more partnerships as much as possible or get good trade deals with other countries in the global arena. So I do think that's one of the main motivations of these nation states to remain neutral. Just to give a bit of context, the first time I read Friend to All, Enemy to None is during Marcos Jr.'s SONA. So the reason why I didn't include it in the info slide is because of the general bias against Marcos Jr. So what I wanted to do is to have debaters explore the validity of the policy without attaching it to Marcos Jr. to make it more or to make it less biased.
That makes sense. But my next question here is for Gov, right? Like, what would the strategy be for Gov? Is it to say that the strategy doesn't work full stop? Or is it to say it used to work, but it's not our priority right now? We have other priorities.
I think they can do both. So for the first one, it doesn't work full stop, given the political context of the Philippines right now, where we are constantly being attacked by China. So a lot of other countries are inching towards the Philippines to promise us protection, like for example, United States, or very recently we conducted joint military uh, practices with the United States, with Japan, with Australia. So these specific actions can particularly mean that remaining neutral could also decrease your capacity to opt into these partnerships in the first place. So that's one of the reasons why it is not going to work given the context of the global arena where it's very, very polarizing. But secondly, the Philippines is under duress given the attack or constant threat of China against our sovereignty in the context of the West Philippine Sea. So there are a lot of reasons for why we cannot remain neutral. For the second part, where it used to work, I think it's more of an assessment of whether or not it is truly beneficial, where we remain as a third world country. So the characterization of the Philippines as a third world country is not because we are a developing country, but because we are not siding with the first world or the second world during the Cold War, because we wanted to maximize both opportunities. So we wanted to remain neutral in a sense that we are tiptoeing between the first world and the second world, which is the communist states. So that's the reason for why we are characterized as the third world. So it used to work in a sense that we are getting economic investments or FDIs from China and also from the West. But I do think that the current political context, especially for Gov, has to be explored for the motion to be, for them to gain a huge advantage against opposition in this particular idea.
Yeah, so I think those are already two very strong arguments for side government here. Like, you can have two discussions at Prime Minister where you say, okay, the first one is that it does not work, and the second one is, even if we assume for a moment that it does work, that is not really our priority right now. But now I'm wondering, how could opposition overcome that strategy now? Like, because if it's a two-pronged attack from Gov, going like, it doesn't work, and even if it does, it's not our priority now, what should the priority be for opposition? Like, how can you expect opposition to defend that making friends is and should be the priority of the Philippines at this point?
All right. So I think one of the reasons for why the Philippines cannot simply just abandon their foreign independent policy of friend to all, enemy to none is primarily because of the existing investments and existing economic projects of many other countries that have invested in the Philippines. So, for example, we simply could not take an antagonistic move against China, given that China holds a lot of economic investments in the Philippines, or the fact that according to numbers from 2016 to 2022, they have invested a substantial amount of $1.7 billion in the Philippines. So these specific partnerships and these specific deals with the Philippines can be damaged or can be affected the moment that the Philippines takes a more hostile stance against China or any other countries in the context of partnering with them. More importantly, I do think that the Philippines is also a unique actor in a sense that we have never really taken a specific stance for or against a specific country. So it's really important for us to assess for the effectivity of neutrality, especially that we don't want to be affected or we don't want to be impacted by global conflict. So I think these are particular conservations or particular hesitations that the Philippines or the Filipino people or the administration might have in terms of picking sides, especially that you're benefiting from both superpowers or from both sides. So it's really important for them to assess how helpful this is in the long run.
So I think on opposition, you might unfortunately have to accept that some of our fishermen will not be treated as well as we would like them to be in the West Philippine Sea. However, we have to weigh that against the fact that a huge portion of our economy, which also affects like the poorest of the poor, is reliant on how well we are treated by China and how well we treat China as well. So you can imagine opposition having the burden to weigh these types of things. So I really like that strategy on op as well because it's also two pronged, right? Like the first prong of that strategy is to say there's an economic aspect here where you're also harming the most vulnerable members of Philippine society. And the second prong here is to say we're going to be involved in so many more conflicts now if we take a stance. And siguro, maybe you can also bring up the fact that the world that we live in today is so full of conflict. Like, I don't know what's up with the 2020s, but like, we have, the West Philippine Sea issue, we have Israel and Palestine, we have Russia and Ukraine, stuff like that. So it really does feel like World War III is about to happen. Like just recently, a new thing happened with Azerbaijan, I think. So I suppose that now more than ever, you can argue that the Philippines needs to like, okay, let's focus on our economy first. Let's not, So aside from those two things, right? Like we have two very strong arguments from Gov, two very strong arguments for Op. How do you imagine both teams to extend in this debate?
All right. So I do think that picking a side is a privileged standpoint for any country at all, given that for opposition, it's really important for them to assess the military power of the Philippines, of whether or not we can contend with other countries in general. So if you pick a side, it's only going to worsen tensions, especially that we are very, very near China or any other superpower in particular. So the fact that we're very accessible to the other side of the spectrum means that picking a side would also mean that we're going to be much more vulnerable to the attacks. And it's also going to make life harder for the fisher folk that are going to be affected by this. So for now, China is willing to listen because we are in constant negotiations with them, given the partnership, given the fact that we have leverage in a sense that they get raw materials from us. But the moment where you cut these things off, or the moment that you become hostile or you take an antagonistic point of view against them, I think it gives them more ammunition to become more punitive against the Philippines. Or in the other side of the spectrum, I think it becomes easier for the United States to, I don't know, exhaust raw materials from us in a sense that they're not going to value contracts or partnerships, or they're not going to support any particular thing that can be impactful towards the Philippines. So I think it's really important for us as well on how badly you're going to be treated the moment you pick a side, and how this is going to affect your relationship with the other countries as well. So I think that could be a good extension for opposition, because when you don't pick a side, it becomes easier for you to negotiate, becomes easier for you to upend other superpower on the other side. But if you become more hostile, it becomes more harder for you. They become more punitive, they become more defensive. I think that's number one for opposition. I think for government, it's more of an assessment. So the world is becoming more polarizing. Superpowers will know when you are not favoring a side. So the first thing, or the first layer that government can say is the resources of these superpowers are very limited. Obviously, they're going to pick a country to support. And if they don't think that they can, if they don't think that you are going to pick a side, they can easily leave you. So the argument can, so opposition's argument of the pulling out of investments can also be flipped by government to the extent that they can argue that these countries will know if you are tiptoeing around them, because you have to prioritize their supporters or their allies in that specific sense. The second is, if they don't pick a side, they will be a casual, they will be affected by the war in particular. So they would not get protection. They're going to be exploited. It's going to be really hard for the administration to function, given that they are stuck in the middle. So I do think that these are the things that government can extend on from the first two arguments that we talked about earlier. So
Yeah, I think those are great points for any debater to make on this motion. So I think before we conclude this episode or this post debate analysis, what I want to ask you is, if you are a debater in the Philippines, is there any advice that you would give to them? Because one of the reasons why Nina and I always want to put Philippine motions in the grand final is because we really hope that debating will translate eventually into something real and something that can help people from our country, people in our community. So, and we asked you specifically to be our motion contributor on this theme because you are, part of these communities. Like, you are actually on the ground doing work to
yeah,
build
I'm in
communities
Batangas
and
right
stuff like
now.
that. Sorry?
I'm in Batangas right now.
Yeah.
Field work.
Yeah, so that's why we asked you specifically, because what you're doing is really in line with what you wanted to do with Debatable just in general. So dalawa, right? One is, how do we debate it better? But second is, how do we, even as debaters, like, we're young, we're kind of stupid, how do we contribute to greater society, ganyan. And also
Okay.
just in general, if there's anything that you're passionate about, na like this is your soapbox moment where parang whatever you want to plug, go lang.
All right. So For the first question, I think a lot of debaters, especially Filipino debaters, overgeneralize things in the Philippines. So a lot of debaters characterize the Philippines as poor. And economically speaking, it is indeed poor. But I think one notable quote that stuck with me during my first year in college was, mayaman ang Pilipinas pero bakit naghihirap ang sambayan ng Pilipino? Which I think is very notable to the extent that it explains the reasons for why the Philippines is poor, but it is rich with natural resources. It is rich with talents coming from multiple people that are good or that can be productive. So I think one of the reasons for why that is the case is because we do not explore the other factors that led to it being poor. So for example, the long-term effects of colonialism, the fact that the Philippine policies are not greatly aligned to the interests of the Filipino masses, given that it can reflect the interests of imperialist countries, or it can be an interest of the elite, or the fact that the Philippines right now is not efficient in terms of producing or manufacturing. So we often allow other countries to exhaust our raw materials for them to process it to their country. So the return on investment is not as great. So don't just characterize the Philippines as poor. Explore the reasons for why the Philippines is riddled with poverty. There are a lot of reasons for why it was the case. It's not because the Filipinos are dumb. It's not because we're uneducated, or it's not because we're inefficient. There are greater reasons that has placed us under dire circumstances. Secondly, I think it's very important for us to also assess the political spectrum of the Philippines. So most of the time, it's often the liberals versus the conservatives. I do think it's very important to also explore the other shades of progressivism. So a lot of people, especially a lot of debaters I hear, they often equate liberal values as progressive. And while I do think that liberal values are also progressive, there are other ways by which we can define or characterize progressivism as, for example, other ideologies or other political standpoints. So for example, socialist, socialist soc-dems or not-dems, or national democrats, or even the validity of groups within the Philippines. So in order for you to debate the political spectrum better, it is very important for you to attach this to tangible organizations, like for example, Akbayan, LFS, or other advocacy groups where they're very vocal about their political ideologies. So I think that's all for how do we debate the Philippines better. Don't generalize, but to also understand the nuances of Philippine politics by exploring the spectrum. For the second part, okay, so how do we contribute to the greater society? And I think this is a big question. But I do want to add that as a social work major who works with the marginalized and vulnerable groups, I do think that's very important for us to go beyond the 7 minutes of our speeches. So if I recall correctly, I wrote an article for the Philippine Debate Review entitled Debate and Activism, where I spoke about the reasons for why a lot of debaters are good, because they can fully talk and express about their advocacies. But there are instances where these advocacies do not leave the debate room or do not leave the confines of the Zoom meeting or the Discord call. And I do think it's really important for debaters, given that we're equipped with knowledge, to also try to go out of our way and to join worthwhile organizations, or to even at least understand the plights of the marginalized outside of the debate context. And while I do credit debate for my critical thinking skills, I do think that it's really important for debaters to move past, and I do think this is cliche, but to move past their comfort zone by understanding these communities outside debate, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I feel like us as a community, we need to start being more curious about, people who have lives and have perspectives that might not be intuitive for us, right? Like, I work with a lot of poor people as part of my job, and I get surprised whenever I hear some things that just like they don't sit right with my, in my opinion, progressive sensibilities. But you have to accept that it's something that resonates with a lot of people for a reason, and
Yes.
a really big part of contributing to society or like communities in general is to understand that the community is not necessarily burdened or obligated to follow whatever you think is the most progressive, right?
Yes.
So I think on that note, we can end this post-debate analysis. Thank you so much, Gab,
Thank you,
for
Pal. Thank you,
agreeing to
Nina.
be our motion contributor and for agreeing to do this interview with us. So for the listeners, thank you for listening. We'll see you in the next one. Bye.
Bye.